My dad refused to spend a single penny on food. People hear that title and assume I'm exaggerating. I wish I were. My father wasn't poor. He wasn't unemployed. He wasn't drowning in debt. In fact, he earned more money than almost anyone in our neighborhood. He simply believed spending money on food was a waste. Growing up, our refrigerator was almost always empty. There would be half a bottle of ketchup, an expired carton of milk, maybe a few slices of old bread wrapped in aluminum foil. Meanwhile, my father had hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting in savings accounts. He tracked every cent, every receipt, every utility bill, every grocery purchase. If my mother spent $5 more than his weekly budget, he'd demand to know exactly where it went. He didn't call himself cheap. He called himself disciplined. Everyone else called him something different. I was 8 years old when I first realized our family wasn't normal. A classmate invited me over after school. His mother made grilled cheese sandwiches, tomato soup, sliced fruit, and chocolate chip cookies. I remember staring at the table, wondering why there was so much food. When she noticed I kept asking if I could take only one piece, she laughed gently and said, "Honey, eat until you're full." Those words stayed with me for years. Eat until you're full. At home, that sentence didn't exist. Dinner was carefully measured. One chicken breast divided among 4 people. Instant noodles stretched with extra water. Vegetables so overcooked they barely resembled vegetables anymore. Seconds were almost forbidden. Dad always insisted that people who wanted more food lacked self-control. As I got older, things became worse. Every Sunday morning, my father gathered grocery advertisements from different stores. Not to compare quality. To calculate which supermarket sold the cheapest rice by weight. He'd drive 30 minutes to save $2 on potatoes. Then complain about the gas afterward. My mother quietly tried to compensate. She secretly packed extra snacks into my school bag whenever she could. Granola bars, apples, peanut butter sandwiches. Whenever Dad found them, he'd accuse her of encouraging wasteful habits. One afternoon, I came home from soccer practice absolutely starving. I'd burned through every bit of energy I had. I opened the pantry. Nothing. I checked the refrigerator. Almost empty. Dad was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing bank statements. I asked whether we could order pizza. It had been months since we'd eaten anything from a restaurant. He looked at me as though I'd suggested buying a private jet. Then he launched into another lecture about financial responsibility. He explained that successful people delayed gratification. That restaurants existed only to separate foolish people from their money. That hunger built character. I nodded because arguing never accomplished anything. That night, I went to bed hungry. Again. The strange part was watching my father boast about his savings. He loved showing relatives investment statements, retirement accounts, certificates of deposit. He proudly announced that he'd become a millionaire before turning 50. Everyone congratulated him. No one noticed his children quietly drinking water before dinner because it helped dull the hunger. Everything finally changed when I turned 16. I got my first part-time job stocking shelves at a grocery store. The paycheck wasn't large, but on my very first payday, I walked straight into the employee cafe and bought the biggest meal I'd ever ordered. A cheeseburger, fries, soup, a chocolate milkshake. I still remember sitting there alone, almost crying after the first bite. Not because the food was extraordinary, because I realized I'd spent my entire childhood believing being hungry was normal. When I got home that evening, Dad immediately noticed $22 missing from my paycheck. He demanded to know where the money had gone. I told him the truth. I bought dinner. His face hardened. He called me financially irresponsible. Then he announced something that completely stunned me. As long as I lived under his roof, I wasn't allowed to spend my own money on food without his permission. I stared at him, convinced I'd misheard. I hadn't. And deep down, I knew that argument was about to change my life forever. For a few seconds, I honestly thought he was joking. Then he reached across the table and held out his hand. He wanted my bank card. Not because I'd broken the law, not because I owed him money. Because he believed he should control how I spent every dollar I earned. I refused. Calmly. Respectfully. For the first time in my life, I simply said no. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. My father slowly stood up. He wasn't shouting. That was somehow worse. He told me that children who paid for unnecessary luxuries eventually became adults buried in debt. According to him, buying a proper meal was no different than gambling or wasting money on expensive clothes. I looked at my mother. She lowered her eyes. She'd heard this speech too many times before. The next morning, I discovered something strange. The snacks I'd bought after work had disappeared from my backpack. Protein bars, fruit, a small bag of trail mix, gone. When I asked my father whether he'd seen them, he admitted he'd thrown them away. He called them impulse purchases. I didn't argue. Instead, I started leaving food in my locker at work. One of my supervisors noticed I always stayed behind after my shift. Eventually, she asked why. I admitted the truth. The employee cafeteria was the only place I could eat until I felt full. She stared at me for several seconds before quietly asking another question. Does your family have enough money? I nodded. We have plenty. We're just not allowed to spend it. She didn't respond immediately. The following week, she quietly enrolled me in the store's employee meal program. Every shift included one free hot meal. She never announced it. She simply handed me the voucher and said, "Don't tell anyone I bent the rules." For nearly 2 years, that cafeteria kept me healthier than my own kitchen. At school, teachers started noticing changes too. I had more energy. My grades improved. I could finally concentrate during afternoon classes instead of counting the minutes until work. Then came the annual physical required for the soccer team. The doctor reviewed my chart. He frowned. According to my records, I'd grown nearly 4 inches over the previous year. Yet I'd barely gained any weight. After asking a few routine questions, he eventually turned to my parents. He asked what my typical daily meals looked like. Before I could answer, Dad proudly explained our strict food budget. He described it as teaching discipline. The doctor's expression slowly changed. He wasn't impressed. He calmly explained that a growing teenager who played competitive sports required significantly more calories than I was receiving. He warned that chronic undernourishment could affect muscle development, bone health, and even long-term growth. My father dismissed the advice almost immediately. He insisted modern doctors encouraged overeating because food companies influenced nutritional guidelines. The doctor didn't argue. He simply wrote detailed recommendations in my medical file. As we left the office, my father crumpled the nutrition pamphlet and threw it into the nearest trash can. That was the moment I realized something. This wasn't about money anymore. It wasn't even about food. It was about control. If spending money improved someone else's quality of life, my father viewed it as failure. A few months later, something happened that changed everything. Dad invited several business partners to our house for dinner. It was the first time in years I'd ever seen him willingly spend money on food. The dining table was covered with roast chicken, fresh vegetables, steak, homemade desserts, imported cheese. Enough food to feed 3 families. I stood frozen in the kitchen. I'd never seen our refrigerator this full. My mother quietly admitted she'd been given permission to spend nearly $500 preparing the meal. $500. That was more than our normal grocery budget for months. As the guests arrived, my father proudly talked about hospitality, generosity, and taking care of people. Everyone complimented the incredible meal. They praised him for being such a thoughtful host. I watched him smile, knowing that less than 24 hours earlier, he'd scolded my mother for buying a dozen eggs because they were too expensive. That was the night I finally understood. My father wasn't trying to save money. He was trying to protect an image. And I had a feeling that image was about to crack in front of the very people he wanted to impress most. I didn't plan to expose him. Honestly, I just wanted the evening to end. I stayed in the kitchen helping my mother refill serving dishes while my father entertained his guests in the dining room. The compliments kept coming. One businessman praised the quality of the steak. Another joked that my father must spend a fortune on groceries. Dad laughed modestly and said he believed family always came first. Hearing those words almost made me choke. Family always came first. The irony was painful. Halfway through dinner, one of the guests noticed me carrying another tray of food. He smiled and asked whether I planned to join everyone at the table. Before I could answer, my father quickly explained that I'd already eaten. That wasn't true. I'd been too busy serving everyone else. The guest insisted. He pulled out the empty chair beside him and told me there was more than enough food. For a moment, I looked at my father. His jaw tightened. Then, forcing a smile, he nodded. I sat down. It was the first proper family dinner I'd had in years. I served myself carefully, still afraid of taking too much. Old habits don't disappear overnight. One of the guests noticed. He laughed kindly and said I didn't have to ration my own dinner. Without thinking, I quietly replied, "I'm used to it." The words slipped out before I could stop them. The table fell strangely quiet. Another guest asked what I meant. I hesitated. I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. so I answered honestly. I explained that we normally didn't have meals like this. That our refrigerator was usually almost empty. That I'd started eating most of my meals at work because it was the only place I could afford enough food. No anger, no exaggeration, just the truth. I expected my father to interrupt. He didn't. I think he was too stunned. One businessman slowly put down his fork. Then he looked at my father. "I thought you said your son worked to save for college." Dad nodded. "He does," the man frowned. "Then why does a 16-year-old need to buy his own meals?" No one spoke. Another guest asked whether I'd really been told not to spend my own paycheck on food. Again, I simply answered honestly. Yes. I even admitted that snacks I'd purchased had been thrown away because they were considered unnecessary expenses. The room became uncomfortably silent. The conversation about investments and business disappeared completely. One of the women at the table, a financial advisor who had known my father for years, looked genuinely confused. She asked him a question that changed everything. "You've always talked about retiring early," she paused. "But what's the point of becoming wealthy if your own family is hungry?" My father tried explaining that he was teaching discipline. Budgeting. Delayed gratification. The explanation sounded much weaker than it probably had in his head. Then another guest spoke up. He admitted he'd grown up poor. Actually poor. His parents had skipped meals because they couldn't afford groceries. He quietly said there was a huge difference between lacking money and refusing to spend it. He looked directly at my father. "You aren't teaching your son discipline. You're teaching him that being hungry is normal." Nobody defended my father. Nobody laughed. For the first time in my life, he had no audience willing to admire his frugality. The evening ended much earlier than planned. The guests thanked my mother for the wonderful meal. Several of them shook my hand before leaving. One even slipped me his business card and quietly told me to call if I ever needed a summer internship. After the last car pulled out of the driveway, the house became completely silent. My father stood alone in the dining room, staring at the untouched leftovers covering the table. Then my mother did something I'd never seen before. She opened the refrigerator, took out every container of leftover food, packed it neatly into smaller boxes, walked over to me, and said, "Take it to your room." She didn't ask for permission. She didn't look at my father. She simply handed me enough food to last several days. For the first time in 20 years of marriage, she had stopped asking him what she was allowed to do. And judging by the look on his face, he had just realized he wasn't the only person whose patience had finally run out. That night marked the beginning of the end, not of my parents' marriage, of my father's control. The next morning, I woke up expecting another lecture. Instead, I smelled bacon. Real bacon. Eggs. Fresh coffee. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. I walked into the kitchen and found my mother making breakfast. A full breakfast. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't hiding anything. She was simply cooking. My father sat silently at the table. For the first time in my life, he didn't comment on the grocery bill. He didn't weigh the bread. He didn't calculate the cost of each egg. He just stared at his plate. A week later, my mother opened a bank account in her own name. She had worked part-time for years, quietly depositing every paycheck into the joint account. Now, she began keeping part of her income for herself. Dad objected, briefly, then stopped. Something about that dinner with his business partners had changed him. Or perhaps, it had finally shown him how everyone else saw him. Within a month, our refrigerator looked different. Nothing extravagant. Just normal. Milk that wasn't expired. Fresh fruit. Vegetables. Chicken. Yogurt. Food that children shouldn't have to feel guilty for eating. It felt strange opening the refrigerator and seeing choices instead of empty shelves. Around the same time, I graduated from high school. I earned a scholarship to a university several states away. The night before I left, my father knocked on my bedroom door. He was carrying a small cardboard box. Inside were dozens of bank statements, investment records, savings certificates, every financial achievement he'd ever been proud of. He placed them on my desk, then quietly admitted something that surprised me. He'd spent 30 years chasing a number. Every promotion, every investment, every dollar saved. He believed that once he reached a certain amount, he'd finally feel secure. The number kept getting bigger. The fear never got smaller. Saving money had started as wisdom. Somewhere along the way, it had quietly become an obsession. He confessed that he grew up in extreme poverty. As a child, there were weeks when his family survived on little more than bread and potatoes. He promised himself that his own children would never experience that fear. Ironically, In trying so desperately to avoid one kind of hunger, he had created another. Not because he couldn't feed us. Because he couldn't stop being afraid. It wasn't an excuse. It was simply the truth. College changed my life. I studied finance. Not because I wanted to become wealthy. Because I wanted to understand the difference between managing money and letting money manage you. Years later, I became a financial planner. Ironically, many of my clients were people just like my father. Successful. Comfortable. Terrified of spending a single dollar. Whenever they talked about cutting every possible expense, I always remembered our empty refrigerator. I'd gently remind them that money is a tool, not a trophy. Eventually, my father began attending those meetings too. Not as a client. As a listener. He rarely spoke, but after each seminar, he'd quietly thank me. One afternoon, several years later, I stopped by my parents' house with my own young son. He ran straight to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and stood there for nearly a full minute. Not because it was empty, because it was overflowing. Fresh berries, juice boxes, cheese, leftover pasta, his favorite yogurt. He laughed and shouted that Grandpa had more snacks than anyone he knew. I looked toward my father. He was standing in the doorway, watching his grandson happily deciding what to eat. There were tears in his eyes. He admitted something he'd carried for decades. I spent my whole life trying to become rich, he smiled sadly. I almost became poor in every way that mattered. Today, my father is still careful with money. He still compares prices. He still dislikes unnecessary spending. Some habits never completely disappear. But now, every Sunday, he insists on cooking dinner for the entire family. He always makes too much food. Every single time. And every single time, he smiles when someone asks for seconds. People often think this story is about a man who refused to spend money on food. It isn't. It's about a man who confused saving for living. He spent years protecting his bank account, while accidentally starving the people he loved most. The richest lesson I ever learned didn't come from my finance degree. It came from an empty refrigerator. Money sitting in an account has no value if the people you earned it for are afraid to open the pantry. Because true wealth isn't measured by what you refuse to spend. It's measured by the lives you're able to nourish. Thanks for reading.